The Jews were so well integrated that they fought in the army, became important people in industry, commerce, literature, and the arts, and we thought they were perfectly safe. I mean, there's nothing that can happen to him. He's a decorated war hero, and if anything happens, all I have to do is to call up a guy who was his commanding officer in the regiment and who was then Minister of War. And my uncle, who was a lawyer, had a classmate who was then Minister of Justice. My other uncle, who was a physician, had a classmate, ex-classmate, who was Minister of Health. So we had all the connections. He led a charge against the overwhelming Russian forces, and that meant a bayonet charge. And he said he never forgot when he bayoneted a guy in front of him, a Russian, and the guy fell and yelled, Shema Yisrael. And he said, think about it, that here we are, two Jews killing each other for the sake of the Tsar and the Austrian, of whom a violent anti-Semite. What business was it of ours to do that? So he couldn't face the idea of leading a charge and killing a fellow Jew for what? I was like 13 or 14 when I was first beaten up on the street for being a Jew. So I went home and reported to my father, and the guy said, we can't have that. So him being an officer and a gentleman, actually he was a CPA, but in his youth he was an officer and a gentleman. And I said, well, and I was sent to learn fencing by an Olympic champion, and I was quite good at it. Except, what in hell do you do with being a fencing champion on the street as you are coming home from school? So I decided with a friend of mine we ought to learn boxing. So we went to learn boxing, and we beat each other up to a pulp twice a week. After about 6 months I felt strong enough to challenge the class bully. The way you challenge the class bully, walked by my desk and knocked my books over, which he did because he was set back twice and was therefore 2 years older than I was. So at this point I said, pick it up. And I said, what did you say? Mouth hanging open. I said, pick it up. So I was ready to hit him. He kicked me you know where. So clearly this didn't work. And when I recovered from all of that thing, I learned finally a defensive sport. The following year I was class champion in the 800-yard dash.
Wow.
Which of course meant that I could get to the nearest subway stop faster than the thugs did. But this is what it took, you know, being constantly aware that you don't know what's around the corner. You better know or else you are in trouble. You went by carefully looking around the corner and ready any moment to take a dash somewhere. It worked. We were marginally Jewish. I kept out of school for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, so we all went to school so that afterwards we could mingle, which we did. When things started to get bad, there were those among my buddies whose parents converted. Not for any faith, but it was safer. And I came home and I said, you know, we are not that religious. Did it ever occur to you to convert? I asked my father, and he looked at me very severely, and he said that you don't run under fire. You stand and fight.
Wow.
So whereas he wasn't terribly Jewish, he wasn't going to be bullied. My father, being a much decorated officer, was exempt from all the anti-Jewish laws, of which there were many.
Right.
And the way you faced these laws, which added every year a new law was enacted. Starting in the 1920s, there was a quota for Jewish college students. There was a quota for various other professions. And then eventually there was a law about having a business larger than a certain number of employees, which were not allowed for Jews to have. It affected us very little. The way you get around it, the way Jews got around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Bribery. The university had a quota, a Jewish quota of 6%. But it was retroactive. So when it started, there were too many Jews to begin with. So for the next 15 years, there were no Jews at all. Make up the overall quota. Not true. All you have to do to go to Uncle so-and-so and say, what do I do? And he said, I call you my friend, who is assistant dean of admission. Wow. And I was in. Yeah. Every inch of my way, I had connections and or money to get through, which is how I got here. Every one of us who got out alive didn't get out accidentally. It took work. It didn't quite work all the time, but it more often than not did work, depending on how good your connections were. It was very unsafe at the university. Every now and then they went around rioting, beating up some Jewish students. You were much better. I had connections, as usual. The guy called me up and said, you better not come in tomorrow. So I didn't go tomorrow, another day. I went to my courses and watched very carefully what I could see in front of the university. Yeah. If there was a crowd milling around, I turned around and went right home. And called up somebody whom I knew and said, what happened? Well, they had elections of the so-and-so society, Phi Beta Kappa society, or Phi Beta Kappa, some obscure society whose president wanted to show where his heart was by going and beating up some Jews. I think it's going to be there tomorrow. Stay at home tomorrow.
Wow.
Yes, sir. I'll give you my notes. You can copy my notes.
And were you able to finish the year in those courses?
No. It's March.
March.
And what they did, they gave us a piece of paper that we completed, which we did not. But that piece of paper enabled me, after the war, to enter a Swiss university. You got it if you knew your professor. And they knew what we were in for, and most of them were quite decent guys and gave me a piece of paper. Well, we didn't know when.
Yeah.
But yes, it couldn't. I mean, look at the map. That's why I printed out at the map. Nazis were in Poland, Nazis were in Yugoslavia, Nazis were in Austria. What prevented them from getting into Hungary? I'll tell you what prevented them. There was a government who felt that it was better to get payment from the Jews and keep the Germans as far as possible out, which is what I did. Somewhere along the line, the Germans felt that this wasn't the right way of handling the Jewish question, and I sent in somebody with a couple of regiments to show the Hungarians how to do that. But it was, look at the map, there was no way we could avoid it.
And so was there an abrupt change of life for you when that occurred, when they invaded?
Yes, of course. Yeah. Up till then, you could bribe your way out of it. You could have connections who told you where not to come to school. And now, all of a sudden, this was replaced by stone-faced SS officers, to whom all Hungarians were considered suspect, but the Jews especially. You see, and at that point, we all agreed that this, I guess, is the end. To do with the Jews. The problem with the Jews, I mean young Jews, was that you couldn't give them a rifle because they were obviously not reliable enough. On the other hand, you couldn't leave them at home when all good Hungarian peasant boys were out there being shot. So they collected them and sent them to what was called labor camps. A labor camp, apart from the obvious one of digging ditches, was mine clearing, which consisted of lining up a bunch of Jewish kids at the edge of a field and told them to march. And wherever there was a mine, it blew up. But you could now send the regular troops through it because now you know where the mine was not anymore. 80% of the young Jewish boys got killed in the process. I didn't go there. I wasn't able. I wasn't going to be blown up for the sake of Nazis. That's when I went hiding, yes. I could still stay there because nobody searched homes. It was too much of a job. I didn't have enough manpower, thank God, to search every Jewish home to find what you can find. They caught people on the streets. They caught if some neighbor betrayed them and told them that he was doing something, like signaling at night to enemy bombers, or which were normally a good enough excuse to get a Jew whom you didn't particularly like into trouble by reporting to the authorities that he saw him with a mirror at night. He says that, well, one way of facing what's happening is to sit here and wait. And the other one is to go into this shady deal. There's no guarantee either way. After the war, half of my family was wiped out by going in one of these shady deals when they brought a car driver to take them to somewhere down to Romania, and the guy pocketed the money and took them straight to Gestapo headquarters, where they were promptly shipped off to Auschwitz. So that's what happens sometimes. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't work. And it's a giant gamble, and you're gambling not only with your life, but with the life of your nearest and dearest. You can risk your own life, but what about your wife and your children? So my uncle, who was much older than I was, said, do we risk it? I, being a teenager, said, yes, of course. I knew then, and I know now, of how risky that thing was. We are today more of us than before World War I. And as my aunt said, she was this big, weighed about 80 pounds. And she walked up to my two grandsons. You never met my grandsons. They are hefty guys, 6'3", 200 some pounds. And she met them when they were still young, grade school kids, but already showing their size. And she got hold. She had to put both her hands around the humorous, and he says, "Good solid stuff. Hitler failed, we succeeded."